It is a really great pleasure to welcome Professor Errington to Charlottesville, to the University of Virginia, and to the Nelson Lectures on Southeast Asia. Joe and I go back a pretty long way. We both found ourselves in graduate school at the University of Chicago in the mid-1970s. And if you could do your math, I'm afraid to tell you, is a century ago. Joe, after graduating in linguistics from Wesleyan University in 1973, continued initially, if I understand right, in formal linguistics at Chicago. And I, after graduating from UC Santa Cruz in anthropology in 1972, ended up in anthropology at Chicago in 1974. I think our intellectual trajectories crossed, although I'm not sure whether it was in the same year, in a class called Language and Culture, which was taught by the very young, very cocky, very brilliant Michael Silverstein. That course introduced Joe and all of us to semiotic concerns concerning form and meaning in language. And ultimately, I think for Joe, a lifelong interest in the dynamics between language and culture, between language and social change, and between the intimate projects of our everyday social lives and the larger projects of state and other social institutions. Unlike the study of formal linguistics, however, this work required actually learning a language, or two, or three. So Joe studied Indonesian with John Wolfe at Cornell, who at that point was sort of the dean of Indonesian language pedagogy. He wrote the textbook we all learned Indonesian from. And in 1976-77, he went to Yogyakarta in Java to study Javanese literature and language at Gajah Mada University. Javanese, if you know anything about Javanese, features one of the most complex, refined, sophisticated forms of linguistic etiquette probably in the world. It has an elaborate set of speech levels, which are extremely difficult to master. So that's what Joe took on. In 1978 to 80, Joe went on to conduct fieldwork in Surakarta, a famed Javanese royal polity at the very heart of Indonesia. In the same years, I went off to the back of beyond in Indonesia, way off at the tail end of the Indonesian archipelago, right north of Darwin, Australia. Surakarta, meanwhile, while having been the center of an old Javanese royal court, was under the force of nationalist dynamics, becoming something of a backwater itself. Joe's study of the Javanese linguistic etiquette in the midst of this larger shift in national political dynamics and social hierarchies resulted in two books. 1985, Language and Social Change in Java, Linguistic Reflexes of Modernization in the Traditional Royal Polity. In 1988, Structure and Style in Javanese, a semiotic view of linguistic etiquette. In the process of all this, Joe actually received his PhD in 1981 and was immediately picked up by Yale University, where he remained throughout his career and is now Professor Emeritus. Joe's undertaken a number of fascinating research projects over the years, of which I'll mention just two. He published in 2008, Linguistics in a Colonial World, a story of language, meaning, and power. This is a historical study spanning the 16th through the 19th centuries of the work of linguists, often missionary, often translating the Bible, whose work to transform spoken languages into written and readable texts also became part of larger colonial projects, often with diverse unintended effects he explores. Here he also thinks through the difference between what it means to be a spoken language or to have a spoken language, speak a language, and what it means to read and write a language. In 2022, Joe published Other Indonesians, Nationalism in an unnative language, which is a great title, which investigates the dynamics resulting from the paradox of the state's project of using Indonesian to create shared national identity in a country where it is no one's native language, and in a country where there are hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and languages. I think we'll hear something about this project today in his talk, which is entitled, I want to say Tale of Two Cities, but it's Two Tales of a City, Language, and Nation. And so here, half a century on, please, and welcoming Joe, my friend Joe Errington.
Thank you, Susie. Real treat to be here. Thank you to Susie, Sylvia, everyone. What maybe is nicest about this is I'm giving a talk in the middle of an academic semester with nothing else to worry about. Never had that experience. Take my word for it. It's great. As Susie guessed, I will be talking about material from the book. I will try and give you a very quick summary of the guts of the argument, and maybe a little more, time allowing. I voiced on you another title because I was trying to be cute with the Tale of Two Cities thing, and then I thought, no, that's the cuteness quotient is too high. So let me be cute another way with this, a linguistic miracle in an improbable nation. And it is cute because that title is directly from two older sources. Joshua Fishman in 1978, in the midst of the Cold War, surveying what they were calling the language problems of developing countries, looked at Indonesia and saw a miracle of language planning. He was maybe not wrong. In 2014, I guess, journalist Elizabeth Pisani went to Indonesia and found a nation which she said is real, but it's improbable. He was in effect wondering how a nation, as I'll get to, could be so large and so heterogeneous. And not only that, it has a national language which is spoken natively by no one and nowhere on the national territory. Yeah, that sounds pretty improbable on the face of it because, well, for anybody, including most of us, I think, assume that nations should have members who share national language. It should be their native language, even if they are not monolingual. And even where that is not the reality is a powerful vision. Prime Minister Modi of India dreams of a Hindi-speaking India. Xi Jinping dreams of a Mandarin-speaking PRC. This is not just something that exists in the world, it is part of what people imagine as a project for a better or a real nation state. And here is one that seems to get along fine without native speakers. So what I'm going to try and do is take this exception to the rule and use it to try and draw out some of the assumptions that make that rule seem like a rule. And I doubt time will permit, but if it does, at the end, I'll say, well, Indonesia may be improbable, but it's improbable in ways that might give us clues about what's happening to other nations and other languages in a post-print globalizing world. That is to say, maybe it isn't that Indonesian is just a weird case in the world now. Maybe it's a step ahead of where other places are going, whether we know it or not. So I'm going to do this here. Here we go. 278 million people. So fourth largest nation in the world, third largest democracy. We could use that word these days. One national language spans an eighth of the circumference of the world. So a territory comparable in breadth with that of the United States. It is now undeniably a single nation. Nobody there will deny it, except some people in the highlands of Papua New Guinea or of West Papua, but I have to bypass that. The miracle is that in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, Indonesia, the word, didn't exist. It didn't come into use until the mid-1920s. And a century later, it is not just a nation, it is the name of a language spoken by almost all of those well, all the adults in that population of 270 million people. So the story, I'm going to tell a story in two modes, two ways. Okay, so the first one will be what I call the standard story of standard Indonesian. This is the fisherman sort of story. And I will not be doing this in chronological order because I have other things in mind. And the other will be a story of what I call vernacular pluralism. And this is the one that flies under the ideological radar and the one that only emerges if you actually do empirical research. And at the end, I will unmask myself as a linguist. And I will ask you to look at sentences. And I apologize beforehand for that. Together, these are going to give you what I'm going to call a valuable paradox. The valuable, not me, I am borrowing this phrase from Gunawan Muhammad. If you're an Indonesianist, you know of him as the Dean of Public Intellectuals in Indonesia. And he said that within Indonesian is a valuable paradox. On one hand, it can unite. On the other, it supports radical diversity. It is used by almost all Indonesians, but historically, it is not a majority language. It's all true. So I'm going to try and unpack this in more prosaic academic terms. So moving right along, talk about Indonesian as a language of official nationalism. That is to say, it was a language of nation-building policies that were systematic, even Machiavellian, instilling nationalist ideology through the mass media, the educational system, administrative regulations, and so forth. This I borrow from Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. People read Imagined Communities? It is a modern classic of the kind that Mark Twain calls a book everybody wishes they had read. And I'm gonna cherry pick from it and hope it makes sense. So this story starts, well, it starts in 1965 when the President Sukarno is deposed in a military coup. Sukarno had declared independence in 1945. He was a tremendous leader of the nationalist movement. He was not an administrator. As president, he faced enormous economic problems, a corrupt, inefficient government, and tension between the military on one hand and the third largest communist party in the world on the other. Segments of that military, with the help we now know very clearly of the CIA, deposed Sukarno on the 30th of September, 1965. And over the next 6 months, between 500,000 and 1.5 million people were killed in massacres. We still don't know how many, still don't know who all they were, but that violence underwrote the establishment of the so-called New Order, which Suharto established. And this is the source of the official nationalism program in which Indonesian came to be a key symbol and a key instrument. So the New Order turns out to be very effective at certain things. It is very good at centralizing power in Jakarta. It is very good at exercising increasingly close oversight and control over all areas of Indonesian territory and making sure that everybody knows it will brook no opposition to its policies and it will accept no genuine political opposition. There will be no public discourse that is not also official discourse. Okay, so we have an authoritarian regime which is legitimized by a developmentalist agenda with full support from nations of the West. We've been made safe for democracy. I recommend a book called The Jakarta Method by Vincent, I believe, Bevins, if you want to know more about how this happened. That's another story. Now, what was done in the sphere of language has been called the regime of standard Indonesian. And again, this is not me. This is a political scientist named Amy Liu, who wrote a book in 2015 in which she used Indonesia as a kind of paradigm for the solution to the problem of multilingual nations. There's a through line, in case you hadn't noticed. So that the New Order acted the state as what she calls a third party to delineate which languages can be used when and where. third party is a strategically neutral way of putting it. But what was being delineated involved not just the values of Indonesian, but its forms, and linguists of those. And because the idea of standard Indonesian was so broad and so abstract, I can take terms for languages from totally different contexts and apply them quite nicely to what official nationalism made of the standard language. Okay, so it was above all a set of established forms, unchanged in different domains of use, which is a description which was used by Widdowson to talk about what we now call global English. That was its value, that it was unchanged across domains of use. It was belonging to no one in particular and so equally available to all. This is the ideal of a totally anonymous language, one which is known to everybody and so belongs to nobody. It is a transparent means of public discourse, which is open to everyone equally. This is from Kit Willard's book on Spain and Catalonia that if I have it right at the end, I'll talk about. It enables formal context-liberated use. This is the way Ernest Gellner talks about the way standard languages need to be supervised by states in order to foster modern nation states and their diversified economies. You see, I'm dashing across these things just to try and show that there's a very broad conception of what language can be that is at work in Indonesia, but it is something that you find in many other places as well. Now, when the new order came in, Indonesian was known only to a tiny group of urban elites. In 1966, the year after he took power, Suharto signed a decree, presidential decree, which led to the establishment of primary intermediate schools, hundreds of them, all across Indonesian territory. The idea was that young Indonesians would become literate and would come to know their national language. This was done under state supervision. These were all state schools or state-controlled schools. And the idea was that they would acquire, well, they would acquire the language, they would acquire literacy, they would also acquire awareness of their place within a nation and also under this large institutional complex of a central supervising state. And in this way, they would learn to be parts of a national citizenry. But it is Machiavellian in the sense that what the state really could worry about was that they have passive knowledge of this language, so it could be a conduit for information coming from the top down. They don't worry about so much about whether kids are learning to speak Indonesian with each other. What they want is the kids to hear the radio and know what they're hearing or read the newspaper, because all of that is controlled by the state. So it's not that they're being enfranchised as political agents within the nation state. It's they're being subordinated into a set of hierarchies. Now, because of Indonesian's abstractness and anonymity, the state didn't have to say Indonesian is better than the language you speak. It didn't have to privilege Indonesian overtly over any other language because he spoke it natively. You have 700 odd regional or ethnic languages. They defined ethnic identities very closely with regions, because once you have defined ethnicity by a region, you say it's subnational, right? But as the territory is subordinate to the nation, so is your ethnicity subordinate to the citizenry of the nation. But the other powerful thing about this way of doing it is that all of these languages and their speakers differ from the language of the nation and modern national citizenship in the same way. It doesn't matter if you're a Javanese and one of 68 million, or a Sundanese, 32.5 million, and so on. Your language's worth and its relation to Indonesian is identical to that of speakers of Ndau, which has 5,000 people speaking on a small island, Sylvie's of Ndau, which is spoken far off in Eastern. I should say, Javanese and Sundanese are spoken, don't have a pointer. That island there is Java. That's 100 million people live there. It's the tail that has always wagged the political dog in Indonesia. But under the regime of the standard, all of these languages are comparable with each other because they're not comparable with Indonesian, right? So this is what is part of the improbable success of a project which, by the numbers, had achieved virtual universal literacy in Indonesia by 2020. Okay, this is a quick and dirty presentation of that. As you look at this map, the darker the area, the fewer people report being literate in Indonesian. So it's no surprise the highlands of Papua have relatively few speakers, but you can see in the highlands of the interior of Kalimantan and so on. But by the numbers, all adults have gone to at least primary and intermediate school, and they are literate in Indonesian. Now, there are two obvious kinds of questions that this immediately raises. First one, what kinds of competence are we talking about? I mentioned before that a passive competence will allow it to serve as a conduit for the government. What about active competence? What about oral competence, being able to speak it with other people, to use it in conversation? Our competences in Indonesian, are they close enough so that somebody from, say, Sumatra can talk with somebody from Bali and be mutually intelligible? They might count as Indonesian, but are they mutually intelligible? Well, that's not a question that gets answered on censuses. And it's not a question that's easy to come up with a quick answer to. So the gap between the letter and the voice, going back to what Susie was saying about my fixation, my oral fixation, right? It is the gap between the letter and the voice that is raised by this. That's one kind of question. The other one is about Malay. This is the same list I had before, but I put Malay in red because it's very easy, all of the things being equal, to say, historically and structurally, Indonesian is a kind of Malay. It is. There are native speakers of ethnic Malay, one of whom I will introduce you to later, whose native way of speaking is mutually intelligible with standard Indonesian. As to say, she speaks Malay, I speak standard Indonesian, we understand each other. So isn't this really just a miracle of rebranding? Haven't you just sort of taken an old antecedent native language and grown it? That's pretty obviously a question. Native speakers of Malay are found on the coasts of Malaysia, the peninsula, and Sumatra. They're found on the coast of most of Kalimantan or Borneo, the island of Borneo. Furthermore, besides the ethnic Malay, there have been for centuries, before the Europeans got there, there were called market Malays, kinds of Malay that you used when you had to deal with somebody across a line of language difference. You didn't share a language. You learned enough of it to get your business done. It could be called low Malay. It could be called mixed Malay. Nobody spoke it natively. Nobody valued it. It was just a way of getting business done. It's sometimes called a pidgin language. But beyond that, there were also urban Malays. And those are the ones that I'm very quickly going to go talk about now, because this is heading into the second part of the story, which is plural vernaculars that I mentioned before. So let me start with the language of what was Batavia when it was founded and what became Jakarta in 1945 when independence was declared. It began as a fort, really, established in 1610. So it's older than New York City. It was one of several important logistic centers for the Dutch military and for trade. When their interests in the area shifted from the eastern part, where the Spice Islands are, more to the central and western part for exploitation of other natural resources, Batavia came to the fore as the center of colonial power. It expanded rapidly, and its power of attraction grew. It was drawing people from all different parts of the archipelago and beyond for a wide range of interests and purposes. So by the early 20th century, it was the home to, I believe, almost 1 million people, and it is a place where was found what a guy named John Furnival called a plural economy. Heard of John Furnival, Plural Economy. He was a British colonial administrator who looked across the straits at Batavia, and he saw an urban place where people were living in close proximity with each other, where virtually every aspect of their life was congruent with racial difference. The place you lived, the people you saw on a daily basis, the language you spoke, the way you dressed, what you ate, your economic niche, all of these things lined up. So there are many people of many different kinds living together in a kind of cooperative relationship driven by the economy, but who otherwise live lives that are entirely different from each other and therefore linguistically different from each other. Now, what that means is when it comes time to talk with people outside of your own group, and that happens in the give and take of urban life, things come up, you need to do your work, you need to talk to people of a different group. What do you speak? You speak a variety of Pidgin Malay, at least initially, right? You just kind of pick it up as you go along. But over time, those Pidgin Malays, although highly variable, they begin to coalesce. They become recognizable, they become habits of speech, which allow them to be thought of as vernaculars, urban vernaculars. And it happens that kids coming up, growing up in the town, acquire those, not necessarily as a first language, but as a second language. So these are ways of speaking that are associated only with the town and only with its residents, which are highly variable, but have no place on the spectrum of thinking about language categories that are available. So that is happening as Batavia expands. At the same time, the empire is having problems generated by its own successes. The greater the exploitative success, the more administrative oversight is needed, the more colonial agents are needed. Not all of them can be imported from the Netherlands. Expensive, not enough people want to do it. You need to hire agents among the colonial subjects. This happens all over late imperial world. Furthermore, in order for those offices to work, because they are in many different places, they have to be people by people who speak many different languages. What do you use? Well, you use Malay. But that Malay is variable. You don't know how to write it down. It's not consistent. It doesn't allow for efficient administrative purposes. This problem develops and it grows and it grows, and there are more and more complaints. Finally, in 1910, the Dutch East Indian government commissions a linguist to solve the language problem. And this is done, Charles van Ophuizen. He codifies and publishes what he calls general polite Malay. Algemeen beschaafd Malays. Sorry, Sylvia, I do the best I can. And this is, and I'm borrowing here from the famous author and leftist Pramudia Anantatur. He called this school language. It's a means of communication, in my translation, between the colonial government and the people, useful only for those who are educated to become civil servants. Okay. So now you have the colonial government disseminating knowledge of their version of Malay to a subaltern elite. Subaltern elite, which is now traveling across the empire, doing their administrative work. Now, this is the same group of people that Benedict Anderson identifies as the proto-nationalists for what he calls the last wave of nationalism in Indonesia. What he says is that the first nationalists in post-colonial nations found themselves in a kind of biographical and political paradox. The biographical paradox was that they were natives, but they were also educated in a language of power, and therefore were radically different from the people they were administering. They weren't really of other colonial subjects. They were in a political paradox because they were being ruled themselves by foreigners, by people who were not from there. And this crisis, it's a crisis of biography, it's a crisis of politics, induced the pirating of the idea of the nation, which they got from their colonial masters, and therefore the idea of Indonesia, which coalesces, begins to float in a vernacular print press in the mid-1920s, such that by 1928, that Malay that had been codified by the Dutch has been pirated and has been baptized into public existence as the language of the nation. This was a famous event called the Pledge of the Youth, the Sumpah Pemuda, which will be celebrated all over Indonesia in a few weeks, October 18th, 1928. One land, one people, one language. So we could say that, yeah, Indonesian is just Malay rebranded, but it has a particular genealogy, let's say. And it is that language in which independence was declared in 1945. So we're back to where I started in 1965. So that is where standard Indonesian comes from. But what I've also gone for is the way that the urban vernacular of Batavia represents a kind of blind spot when it comes to the regime of the standard. People from different ethnic regions, native languages come to the town, they learn its urban vernacular. It's not an ethnic language because it doesn't have a territory. Ethnic languages have territories. It's not really a native language because not everybody who learns it in childhood. It's a kind of Malay, but it has a whole lot of words that you also hear in Indonesian. But it is the word, this is the language of urban life. You have to learn to speak this way if you want to be a modern Indonesian, because that means you're living in the city. Okay. And in the places where I've worked, you can see it all. Kids come in from the peripheries. Their Indonesian is strong. They've learned it well in the schools out in the boonies, and they come into town and they find out the minute they open their mouths that they're the laughing stock. Why? Because they sound so stiff. They sound so formal. And they learn very quickly that they've got to learn the town's urban vernacular if they want to get by, or they're going to be a laughing stock the whole time they're there. And pretty soon, of course, they've internalized it and they will make fun of other people when they come in as well. This is part of becoming a modern Indonesian now. And the reason I'm dwelling on it in Jakarta is because it was this kind of Malay which some of the officials of the government saw as a solution to this problem, which is a problem everywhere. They were seeing towns expanding all over the country. They were seeing the need for some kind of vernacular. So the leader of the office doing this said, well, you know what's going to happen? Jakarta Malay, the Bahasa Jakarta that I talked about before, we're going to call that informal standard Indonesian, and that will be used in all the other cities too. So you take a variety of Malay that's say, let's say 400 years old, and you say, no, it's just a variety of this language that we created 40 years ago, and that solves our problem. Right? So it's really an Indonesian, even though it's not, it is the standard, but it's informal. But that isn't what happened. What did happen was that cities all over the nation expanded hugely under the new order, right? Because oversight requires people. So you have an exploding bureaucracy. You have the military all of a sudden everywhere, the police. This brings in money. This means blowing up economy thanks to government-driven economies in various regions. Cities become nodes for movement of persons, goods, communication, infrastructures of mobility. They become the places associated in their regions with consumerism, TVs, refrigerators, motorcycles, good modern stuff. And they also become focal for political change and political conflict, as I'll try and show in a minute. So now Indonesia is a place where fully half of all people are living in towns that are in size between 50,000 and 1 million. Jakarta itself is more than 10 million. And 30% live within spheres of influence, you know, not terribly expensive or long ride away. So urban centers everywhere have become the major foci for ongoing development and modernization. So with that in place, let me go back to the question of standard Indonesian as a kind of Malay. And, you know, if it's mutually intelligible with some kind of Malay, why are they not the same language? And This will start me on the last leg of the talk, I hope. Here I want to get specific. This is from research that we did in a town called Pontiana, more in a minute. I just want to put this up here to emphasize ideological difference between ethnic and national in this case. So this is a quote from an interview one of my colleagues did with an ethnic Malay in her mid-30s, high school graduate. And it happened towards the beginning of the interview when our standard opening question was, so what all languages do you know? And she listed them, including Indonesian. He said, oh, so how do you feel about, you feel your Indonesian is strong? And he kind of stopped, and then she said this. She said, when I'm speaking with people who are from Jakarta, and like, I get confused. My way of talking is influent, not fluent like people usually. My language, my way of speaking is, okay, mau kemana? That's Malay, where are you going? Standard greeting, right? How are you? Equivalent. And I forget, she says to herself, mau kemana? They won't understand, right? Oh, mau kemana, where are you going? So if I use good Indonesian, they'd understand. But I have to think first, oh, how is it in good Indonesian so this person understands? Speaking correctly, people think you're crazy. This person's crazy. If people don't understand even a little, you get called crazy. Well, I stepped on the last sound in this mau kemana, that sound with the backward E, that's a lot of schwa. It's an sound, very Malay. Every Indonesian knows that sounds like Malay. I had a Javanese friend who said, oh, they do that because you hit them on the side of the head and they go, ooh. Not me. Well, what's just as important is the way you would say this in standard Indonesian, which is mau kemana. Kind of sounds alike, doesn't it? Mau kemana, mau kemana. The only difference between these, and it's her example, not mine, is that one ends in and the other ends in ah. One is Malay and one is Indonesian, and if she does it in Malay, people will think she's crazy. That's the regime of the standard at work, right? That's why ethnic Malay is different from standard Indonesian. It's not a matter of structure and history. It's a matter of how people feel about them, the kinds of self one puts on display when one chooses to speak in one manner or the other. What she does speak fluently that is not exactly Malay is Pontianak's urban vernacular, and that's what I want to take a minute now to very quickly talk about. But again, I need to give you some background. So we're talking about island of Borneo. The Indonesian part is called Kalimantan. It's most of it. It's just not northwest coast, which is Sarawak, and Brunei, which is Sarawak's part of Sabah, which is Malaysia. So Pontianak is a city where the Malays are about a quarter of the population, or about a third of the population in the province. They're mostly along the coasts. There are Chinese, speakers of two different kinds of Chinese. They're about a third of the city population, but only 8% of the province because they're almost exclusively urban residents. Dayaks, use the term advisedly, are relatively rare in the city, but there are as many of them in the province as there are Malays. So these are by far the biggest constituencies in the province. Javanese, these are trans migrants. They left the island of Java to come here in search of economic opportunity, 12%. But if I took all the other islands that have trans migrants from them and listed them, it would take too long. Basically, they form a quarter of the population of the city. They're coming from Madura, they're coming from Sunda, they're coming from Sumatra, they're coming from Sulawesi, they're coming from, because there's money to be made here in Pontianak. About that in a minute. So Pontianak, at least until recently, has been home to its own kind of rural economy, and it's rooted in colonial history. It was founded in 1771 by ethnic Malays, it was a sultanate. But soon after, the Dutch came in and agreed to help the Sultan fight off competing sultans down the coast if he would allow some Chinese to be settled there, basically to handle commerce, which was coming down the Kapuas River. This is a 600-mile long river into the interior. It's the major avenue for movement of goods. The Sultan agreed. Outside of the city, in the interior, where the Dayaks, the word Dayak means upriver, and that was the term used by outsiders for people who were in fact speakers of at least 100 different languages, having different cultures scattered throughout the huge interior of the island. But on the coast and in Pontianak, look, they're illiterate, they're not monotheist, they're pagans, and all they are vassals of the Sultan, and they should consider themselves lucky to be able to give him tribute. Now, so the Chinese basically control the economy, and their power expands, as does the economy, which is a matter of exploitation. First, it's bird's nest and camphor, but then by the time of World War I, it's rubber. And not long after that, it's timber, and now it's palm oil. Right? All of these are being produced in the interior, coming down the river to Pontianak and out to the world, fully enmeshed in the global economy. At the same time, under the new order, ethnic Malays are in charge of the government and the military. That's their province. Young educated Dayaks are very few in town, but they have had their primary, secondary schooling in the interior. Now they've come to Pontianak. They've gotten a high school education. They're all fluent in Indonesian. They're using it with each other. And they're thinking about themselves as a political constituency. What language do they do that in? Indonesian. Sound familiar? A subaltern elite using the national, a proto-national language to assert a political movement, which they have now done. It becomes possible in 1998. The new order falls through a combination of strife within the government and global finance. Even before it fell, interethnic conflict, bloody interethnic conflict is happening in the area around Pontianak. Elections all of a sudden become free. They become real. You can actually have a chance of being elected if you're not a government candidate. And Chinese begin to mobilize to run for office. In 2000, there are riots in the streets of Pontianak in the run-up to elections. And it happens again in 2008 in elections which send a Dayak to the governor's chair and a Chinese to the vice governor chair. This is, for the Malays, the world turned upside down. The Chinese now, they don't just run they don't run the economy. Now they're getting into the government. Things are not calm and serene, and Pontianak is what I'm going for here. So you start seeing, I've been mentioning this is just a kind of representation of a better situation. It's called, this is a motto that is used in town, and ethnicity and harmonis. Yeah, ethnicity and harmony. It's no coincidence, by the way, that you recognize the first and last word in that slogan. This is a statue that's in front of the newest mall in Pontianak, right? So you have, there's the Chinese, there's the Malay, there's the Dayak. You can just see the end of the KFC sign in the upper left-hand corner. You get children's books like this, right? So here's your Dayak, here's your Chinese, here's your Malay, and they've thrown in, I think, a Buginese. Okay, that's they're not part of what I'm going for here. What I'm saying is that everyday life is heavily inflected by ethnic background of the residents. So now I pose a question: so how do people talk to each other? It's not standard Indonesian, at least not all the time. And here I get empirical on it. Sorry. We did about 70 hours of everyday conversation recorded and transcribed and worked on it a lot. I'm just picking out a few examples. How do Malays and Chinese talk to each other? Here's an example from a conversation between a college student, an ethnic Malay. He grew up outside of Pontianak, but he lives there now. And he's talking to a Chinese who speaks Teochew. They're talking about the trip this Chinese guy makes between Pontianak and another large town down the road. The Malay speaker says, "Nah, kalau misalnya pulang malam berani sendiri sini." And so, are you brave enough to come home at night by yourself? And the Totu speaker replies, sebenarnya ndak berani sih, hanya nekat aja kalau mau pulang malam. But I want to point out that first, this is a suffix, very common in Indonesian, nominalizing suffix, nya. It does a lot of different things. It is the same suffix that he uses on misalnya, which means for instance, and sebenarnya for actually, okay? And the guy in Malay, he says it nya. He says it in Malay. Chinese guy says it nya, says it in standard Indonesian, which is the pattern of these two guys. The ethnic Malay speaks ethnic Malay, the Chinese speak standard Indonesian. It's very common among Chinese residents of Pontianak. They speak Chinese in their in-groups, they speak standard Indonesian out, period. You can see why, they don't want to sound like Malays. Right? The Malay, on the other hand, is quite happy inhabiting his ethnic identity because he knows very well the guy understands him. The guy can't pretend not to understand him. So what we have here is a kind of, they're patrolling the linguistic and social border, right? This is just an epiphenomenal reflex of the tensions that I talked about before. And I mentioned this because it is by far the exception to the rule in this town. Because almost everybody else, I'll skip that, is going to engage in what I don't know what to call except mixed use. So I'm just look at the letters in red, okay? So a Dayak is talking with a Malay. They're both college students. The Dayak uses the sound when he said, "Bipitnya orang tua di mana." That's not his native language and it's not standard Indonesian. Is it Malay? No, he's not trying to sound Malay. He's trying to sound like he's in Pontianak. That's where he lives. And that's why he will mix them. He will say biasa berapa lama, the sound, and then the sound instead of biasa berapa lama, which would be the Malay way of saying it. Malay guy does the same thing. Paling jap berapa? 10 juta jap. So he uses the he uses the he's mixing them up. Is he trying to not sound like a Malay and failing? No, this is how you talk if you live in Pontianak, at least if you're young and hip in Pontianak. These are almost all college students. Don't want to get too much, I don't want to hit it over the head, but here are some more examples. Dayaks talking with each other will talk this way. Okay? Manu bisa mati. Okay? An ethnic Javanese, somebody who grew up in Java or Jakarta and moved to Pontianak and has lived there for 12 years and has a Malay wife. And he says there's the and then he says exactly the same word, but with the and then he says Jawa, except he says a Jawa, okay? He's speaking to an ethnic Dayak, right? Who is not, you know, she doesn't think, oh, why is he speaking like a Malay to me? She understands this is how she speaks too. Misalnya, you do, okay? So I've just picked out one little thread from the fabric of the vernacular of this town, try and show that this vernacular is there. It is, I like to say, it's effacing the condition of racial difference without erasing it. Nobody is trying to pretend they're part of a group they're not part of, but nobody is inhabiting that exclusively. Okay? So that is the one point. The other is that this is an urban vernacular. This is Indonesian. This is a language of modernity. You move to Pontianak, if you're a Dayak, if you're a Javanese, Malay, it doesn't matter. You've got to learn to speak this way if you want to fit in. Okay? So the point I'm going for is that urban vernaculars differ as do their cities, and the cities differ as do their regions. Right? The history of Pontianak is different from the history of other towns. Kupang is much more like Jakarta. Kupang is a place where they've got a single koine, as we call it, right, which is quite commonly used. So these urban vernaculars are mediating in everyday speech between their surrounding regions and the nation as a whole, because after all, we're dealing with a kind of Indonesian. This is national modernity. Okay. So I've been calling it mixed language. Indonesians call it basa gado-gado. Gado-gado is kind of mixed up vegetable salad. It's the word that guy Gunawan used to talk about it in that article I quoted at the beginning. Call it biaccentual. Does that word sound weird to you? I hope it does. Maybe I hope I can get back to it. So what it is people don't always use the term. They didn't always recognize it if we asked them about it. But it pops up in conversation. So in one conversation, we heard a Dayak student talking to some Dayak friends about another Dayak student who had just moved to town. And he says about this other guy, I almost die laughing when I hear him talking, forcing himself to speak Bahasa Pontianak language. So it's as if coming up underneath the use of the phrase indicates the existence of the awareness of the variety as locally distinct. This is the way that Indonesian is getting plural. The language is pluralizing in its vernacular forms. So the plurality, well, so you can have the Koinese, as I said, like Jakarta and Kupang's language. You can have this accentual usage. Where you have largely monolingual populations, you get solid language, like in Java. I can cite some sources if you're curious about that. What they all have in common is that they emerge from, and at the same time allow the existence of what sociolinguists call these days communities of practice. This is a phrase which we use to talk about ways of coming together around mutual engagement in an endeavor, ways of doing things, ways of talk, beliefs, values, power relations, or practices. And what we're looking at are practices of being a modern citizen of the Indonesian nation. Right? Their strength is exactly in the fact that nobody notices them or barely notices them. It allows them to be structurally interstitial between the national and the regional. It allows them to be socially constitutive for everyday life. It allows for interactional expressivity, situated, contextually inflected when you speak. And it makes Indonesian a banal language. It becomes banal, right? It becomes an everyday thing. This is what we do. And it becomes a source of what Michael Billig calls the banality of nationalism, right? It's matter-of-fact everydayness, despite the fact that it's ideologically freighted and socially constructed. I take 5 more minutes. I want to come back to the question of Indonesia not having native speakers another time from another angle, with another objection that I can imagine people making. And so sure, in 1928, Indonesian had no native speakers, okay? That was 3 generations ago. And is it not the case that Indonesians coming of age over that time have learned Indonesian as children? Doesn't that mean that they're native speakers? That's what a native speaker does, right? It's a language they acquire before puberty. That's how it works. Benedict Anderson thought so. Well, let me just point out, right? Remember, I said I was giving you a version of Bruno Wen's valuable paradox. This is what it is, right? There's no difference in this vernacular between foreign, native, low and high, margin and center. There never was one. I'm trying to explain why he can say that, or give you my version of what he's saying when he says that. And now let me hop to what Ben Anderson says about native speakers of Indonesian. Again, this is from his work on post-colonial nationalism. 30 years ago, he was writing in 1980, so this is the 50s. Almost no Indonesian spoke Bahasa Indonesia as his or her mother tongue. Today, there are perhaps millions of young Indonesians from dozens of ethno-linguistic backgrounds who speak Indonesian as their mother tongue. This is what I've always done with, right? My stance to Ben Anderson is, yeah, but. And I have a yeah, but here, right? Which is, yeah, but the vast majority of those millions of young Indonesians aren't just acquiring Indonesian. They're acquiring an ethnic language. And if they're acquiring Indonesian, they're acquiring it with an ethnic accent. They are natively bilingual. Such a thing is not uncommon in certain parts of the world. So saying that Indonesian is their mother tongue is a little misleading. And deserves to be unpacked a little bit. Okay. Now, for him, this is a valuable assertion because it allows him to say, look what happens when official nationalism becomes popular nationalism. His argument is that nationalism has modularity. It can shift from one mode to another. And the fact that there are native speakers of Indonesian shows who are switching to popular nationalism, which is the kind we think of as normal, monolingual, homogeneous populations in native state. But the question I'm asking is one that I'm borrowing from a linguist named Peter Miskins. He said, we are all native speakers. What language? This is the title of an essay he wrote for a volume that appeared in 1998, which was devoted to the question, are speakers of English from South Asia native speakers? I don't know, this was a class, I'd take a poll. They say, sure, but in 1998, there was a significant body of people with influence who said, no, native speakers of English are found in the United Kingdom and its former settlement colonies, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And totally a surprise. And to that, we say, that's racist. I mean, well, no, it's reading colonial history onto the biographies of individuals. Those kids are acquiring English in childhood. You say, well, but it's not good English. By what standards? American standards, British standards? And not all of them are terribly fluent. No, not all of them, but some of them are. Some of them are highly fluent. That's the question he was talking about here. They are all native speakers. What language are they a native speaker of? And the controversy points to the way that the category native speaker is a natural category. It describes the genetic capacity we all have. Every genetically normal human will acquire language competences before puberty that are different from those they acquire after puberty when neuroplasticity subsides. Native languages are in that sense inalienable. Even when you speak another language, the marks of your native language will be there. So what that means is, besides being native speakers, to be a native speaker of a language is to be aggregated to a group. And that group is not always defined purely by language. In fact, it's usually defined by race, class, nationality. Okay? You may grow up acquiring English as a kid in Bombay, and you may be, in fact, highly literate, and by the time you leave high school, some people will choose to say you're not a native speaker, not on the basis of your competence or your intelligibility, but on the basis of colonially based categories. Now, how do these aggregations happen? How do people get recruited to a social category in the ways they speak natively? Anderson has an answer for that too. It's what he calls an outcome of print capitalism. This is the argument everybody knows from Imagined Communities. They read chapter 2 and they're done. Print comes along, makes texts widely available, makes them a commodity. It becomes in the interest of printers to maximize their markets. Therefore, they try and produce texts that are legible to people, as many people as possible. And that means people who may speak in very different ways. What they're concerned about is what he calls the silent privacy of acts of reading, because these are, for him, the place that nationally imagined communities take hold, right? This idea that we have ambient subjective awareness of all those other people who read the same language as we do, and it creates this sense of deep horizontal comradeship. But he notes there that print image national languages are far fewer than what he calls the idiolects they subsume. Let's call them dialects instead, okay? And those dialects lose what he calls caste relative to higher status cousins. So we're putting this in a kind of familial idiom, right? And what happens is that one or some subset of those dialects come to be associated with the language, which is why if I'm here, I'm simply speaking English. I'm not speaking a dialect of English. Here, maybe I have an accent. If I was back home, I would not have an accent. And in fact, this is American English. Sorry, that's just, stick the American in there if you want, but this is it. right? There are many ways of speaking that would have to be modified. You would have to say African American English. Maybe you would say Southern English, or you might impose a value judgment, a broken English, fragmented English, ungrammatical English, right? All of these, of course, are judgments just on the way of speaking, but on the speaker, right? And those become judgments on the internal essence of that person, even though we're looking at an activity. That's just the way it works, okay? So what print literacy does is give us some ways of speaking and creates them as neutral images or exemplars of best native speakerhood, to borrow Michael Silverstein's line, okay? And what that does is it peripheralizes and maybe subordinates other ways of speaking in what turn out to be social hierarchies, and they naturalize those hierarchies. This is what Indonesian doesn't do. This is what Indonesian doesn't do. And what I'm going for here is the reason I want to say Indonesia does not lack native speakers of its national language. It has an enabling absence of native speakers of its national language. The dynamics I was talking about before are only possible because those people acquiring those urban vernaculars have no shared awareness that somewhere out there in their nation is somebody who speaks good Indonesian who is different from them. They know what the regime of the standard is, but there is nobody behind the regime of the standard who exemplifies it. Okay? And that is what enables the valuable paradox of Indonesian. So that is, that's the argument, that's the guts of the book that Susie was talking about. I think I don't want to go long. If I were to go on in the negative 10 minutes I have remaining, but I won't, I would talk about things going on in, well, for instance, Europe that make it look as if that standard native speaker ideology I'm talking about is beginning to lose its hold. So people don't know it. They'd be upset if they did. So thank you. That's all.
Joe, thank you so much for this. Before we go to the Q&A, I just want to say that some of us will be going out to dinner, but we might very well have questions to ask. Perhaps we can sort of keep them to ourselves for now and save them for dinner and just give the floor to those of us who unfortunately won't be there. Would you like, let's say, 1 minute to talk to your neighbor to sort of digest the talk and see if you can come up with a question or something that you'd like to talk about, or do you feel ready to go? Let's take 1 minute, turn to our neighbors, get to know one another, give Joe a chance to have a sip of water, and then I'll just see what kind of question.
Sorry, didn't mean to throw a fire hose at you.
Many southern so I didn't know here.
Well, you need proof that
This is what I mean. Yeah. I did stuff. Once you get something. Yeah. That's also the problem. Yeah. Both countries are large. Be larger.
I think that,
I thought it's the
That really.
Asian
that's right, non-American. She's asking about where So as Boston, Texas, Southern, it's really interesting.
Pittsburghese.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like
Want to be as unaccented, which is really what just generates this language just because children with an accent.
It's like something.
But I understand that
All
like
in
sense are.
No, I wanted to talk
Yeah.
because the native ideology says we all have to by accessible, I would say, I didn't get it. That's the native ideology.
That sort of sense, right, you know.
Several generations.
Thinking about the hill. It's sort of similar. I'm seeing kind of resonance into that of this like. That's control that is.
Right, and but the younger generation
We're like modern. To this. So it all gets evenly.
So their challenge is just like all press. It's very hard.
That's so cool.
They operate.
Yeah, it's like the ideology of, you know, you have language, right? And part of the monolingual.
To find some literature.
You guys know when.
And so that's another talk about it.
There'll be many Fridays.
I don't.
Let's say with the gun.
Plenty of
It's about the yard that I would make.
Okay, let's see where we are, and if there's interesting comments or questions that we'd like to ask.
Just curious about a couple things. I vaguely recall Indonesia boasts the largest number of Muslims in the country. Within their country. And then also Dutch being the colonizer, or another one, I should say, have any of, Muslims is supposed to read the Quran in original Arabic, right? So I'm just curious, has any of those two languages like Dutch and or Arabic slipped into the quote unquote national Indonesian official Indonesian?
Yeah. Short answer, yes. Dutch. Enormous numbers of borrowings, many languages in Indonesia. Dutch began to lose out to English probably in the 60s. They stopped coming in from Dutch and they started coming in from English. But words had been introduced from Arabic probably for the, well, they were introduced into Malay and also now into Indonesian, many, many words. from Arabic. I guess I'd say, I don't think their Arabness is, people don't feel, they don't feel that. Right, you can tell by looking at them that they're from Arabic, but they're not used as if, oh, now I'm using an Arabic word. There's, we're like maksud, which means intention, right? You can hear it sounds Arabic, right? But nobody, that's for linguists, right? It would be like saying in English, question is a French word. Oh, yeah, it comes from French, but no, English, it has that sort of feel about it. Yeah,
It's like a lot of the full French words like
yeah.
tête-à-tête, et on that, all
Yeah.
that is English.
Yeah, even that slogan I put up that sign that said Bahasa menunjukkan bangsa, right? That your language indicates your nationality. Well, bangsa and bahasa are both from Sanskrit or from South Asia. But now they're used to express nationality, so that the provenance of words gets bracketed very quickly in Egypt. Nowadays, actually, there are a lot of people who worry about English because there is so much of it. But that's another story. I will go into that. It's not just, and that answers your question.
Question. Wow, so these like in Indonesia is kind of like newly invented. But like usually like these invented thing want to show is continuity from the past. How it's related to its tradition, because like nationalism is not only about like how to make your nation distinct from each other, but also like related to the national myths and some memories. So I want to know how this like Indonesian is related to the people's understanding of their national identity in general, especially like who we are when it's kind of its language kind of is passed from like ethnic memories and how to understand the nation.
I could have said more when I talked about language and ethnicity. Let me try some more. I'll try again. The New Order, when it was propagating its version of the nation and the national identity, never said that your ancestors, your local values, your local traditions need to be left behind. They never said that. They would say, no, those are to be valued, those are to be guarded, those are to be protected. What they never said was, those are to be adapted to the conditions in which you have them. They become emblematic and they become standardized versions of the past. In many cases, they are turned into economic goods for tourists. This happens in many parts of, the small groups of Eastern Indonesia. Their traditions of dance, music, burials, all of these things, dress. These all become emblematic of us, but what we are then are exotic others. And Susie can tell you more about this than I can, right? But in fact, it draws them into the economic sphere because it attracts tourism and tourism. So on one hand, the state says, no, we would never try to make you change your customs, but we won't be able to, and nor do we want to change the forces that are going to change them for you. Yeah, it's that kind of, very quickly, I worked in Java and they are the dominant ethnic group. And what happens with Javanese tradition there is that the New Order takes the traditions of a very small noble elite and says, this is Javanese tradition. Although it is a set of practices which 3% of all Javanese ever use, but it standardizes them and it says, here, we want to preserve your traditions. Here they are. Here, we're going to teach you Javanese in the schools. What they teach is this high language that only ever elites used and nobody ever uses. Right? So we're here to protect your traditions, but they have a knack of being molded into the how to say, the the mold of homogeneity. They're all different in the same way.
Understand like the very traditional part is not people's like life. It's not their, if we understand culture as lifestyles, it's no longer their real culture in their life. So their life is also like westernized, modernized, so the language part is not a problem.
It need not be a problem when people start, when the kids stop learning the language, which is happening in many places. It is possible for the last 15 to 20 years for the state to step in and say, oh, your language is dying, we have to help you save it. How do we save it? We write it down. We teach it in the schools. But what the kids are learning is not the spoken language, right? That's what their parents do. Right? So again, now the local, the state doesn't have to say, we don't care about your local traditions. We just want those traditions where you are to look like traditions everywhere else. If I write down your language, I'm going to do it with the same orthography I use for standard Indonesian. I'm going to teach it in Indonesian schools. It ends up looking like Indonesian. It's domesticated to the national project. Is that I'm not trying to be optimistic here. I'm just trying to, this is what, that's what I think is going on. If I might add quickly, by the way, talking about language death, is this interesting as a topic?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Wouldn't have thought it of you. Most of those 720 languages are spoken by very small groups in Eastern Indonesia, or this away. And many of them now are no longer controlled actively by young persons. And if you look at the popular press in Indonesia, they're all saying Indonesian is killing local languages. They're dying because of Indonesian. If you look, you see that it's not standard Indonesian that is killing those languages. It's the local urban vernaculars. So the town of Kupang, Sylvia and I have both worked, has its own urban vernacular. And that is the language that the kids in surrounding areas want to learn and are learning. They don't, they learn standard Indonesian in school. They actually speak it pretty well. But what they want to learn is a language of pop music in Kupang. They want to be able to fit in if they go there, right? They may have a cousin or somebody who's in university there and they come back and they hear them and they want to speak that way. So it's the urban vernacular, which, as I said, it flies below the radar. People don't, they think it's standard Indonesian that's doing the work. It's not, it's the urban vernaculars.
The little that's in my head about the languages of Indonesia is that they're very hierarchical and ornate and this, that, and everything. So I was startled in your conclusion when you were saying this, that the Indonesian that's being spread now, it doesn't mark differences. Very, I don't think you said egalitarian, but that's what struck me. The stereotype. Now, I'm not sure if the stereotype is correct, but that comes from maybe Ward Keeler and hearing Jim Fox talk about speaking Japanese.
For sure.
So what is that?
I think, yeah, your description fits best Javanese. I can mention some sources if you want to find out more about it. But Javanese is, Sundanese has some of it. But those are, and it's only the elite Javanese, by the way. Go out into the villages and you will hear very little of that fancy stuff.
And is any of that paradigm of being ornate and hierarchical, is any of that moving into this new language?
No more than it is in most of the languages of the region. That is to say, not hierarchical, but polite. Right? There are norms of politeness that would seem perhaps arcane to us, but they're not matters of different vocabularies. They're matters of uses of vocabularies everybody knows anyway. So for instance, if you want to be polite, avoid using the words means you. It's very rude. Somebody you don't know. If you want to refer to the person you're talking to, choose a kin term. Okay, so that's politeness, but it's not a matter of hierarchy or here are 5 different words for you. It's a matter of, right? Or if you can do it, don't use the word you when you're talking about them. Create a passive sentence that doesn't refer to the person, right? So instead of saying, would you eat, you say, did you eat it? You would say, sudah dimakan, rather than, that's an impersonal or third person passive, okay? But that's just using the machinery the language has anyway to be polite to people. But once you get past Javanese, those fancy vocabularies, the 5 second person pronouns, the 3 first person pronouns, no, you don't see much of that.
It's kind of a follow-on question, because I was thinking about something similar and whether, not necessarily like that you're using the same mechanisms, but that you're sensitized to making these kinds of distinctions such that Indonesian is kind of like the equivalent of the polite form in a sense, like you've all established yourselves now as of the status that, right, we're speaking some different way. And I was thinking about it too with regard to the final vowels. I don't know if that's like a word, a part of the word that people are kind of honed in on for marking social difference. I know so little about these languages, but it just, I didn't know if that was just very handy because it's easy to segment off and put in red, or if because there is something about the word final zone that people are already culturally inclined to attend to as some indicator of interactional, difference or distinction or
Right.
something like that. I'm just,
I think the sensitivity or awareness is contextual. I think when these guys are talking to each other, they know it, right? Because they're failing to accommodate each other.
Yeah.
Right, they have the competence, but they're not using the competence to reach a kind of mutuality of speech, right? But when these guys are speaking, no, it's how we talk. It's no big deal, right? It's just, we're good. It's cool.
it's more about not making distinction.
Yeah, it's relaxing, right? Don't be uptight, don't relax a little, right? Throw in a couple of oohs. That shows you belong here. Now, a sound let me just quickly go back. See the word meaning brave or willing, right? Okay. Everybody will notice this. They will notice the g sound. That's Malay as hell. Berani. Okay, as opposed to the Indonesian, which is a tap, which is berani. Okay. But the reason they're going to notice that isn't just that it's Malay, it's that it sounds bumpkinish. You don't just sound like a Malay, you sound like an uneducated Malay. You sound like you're from the boonies. Right? So that is the radar moving not just ethnically, but on class difference as well. Right? So native speaker awareness it's a tricky thing. I have, but I will not put up a sort of chart showing the degrees of use of these 2 things by members of different groups. I could, that's the quantitative way, the inductive way of doing it, but that's no fun. I'll spare you that.